Dr. Kathleen Dunley, and I'm the chair of the English department at Rio Salado College. And I'm inviting you into my home office to talk a little bit about organizing a research project. As a professor, I do a lot of research, even just for fun. And so right now I'm actually working on a very short, kind of 5 to 10 page research paper that's going to give my view on a historical subject of interest to me. And so my research focus is comparison contrast. And so I'm going to be comparing the work of one writer and artist, a man named Chris Ware, to another writer and artist, a man named Rudolf Toffler, because I see a lot in common with them. And my research question focuses on the fact that no one out there has really done much with this connection. And so I'm going to be asking, what stylistic points of similarity can we see, and why is it important, right? Those are the kind of the basic broad research questions without getting into too much detail. And so I have a huge pile of materials here. Some from the library, some from my own collection of books, some from the internet, and other ones that I've found just through researching and photocopying magazines or whatnot to add to my project pile. And because it's a pretty short paper, similar to the kind y'all in English 102 will be writing, I don't have a very daunting pile of sources, right? But what I definitely need to do is organize them so that when I start to do my writing, I know where to pull my quotes and where to find the information I need. And so I found a few really neat articles on ProQuest that deal with both authors. And so I'm going to make a pile that's specifically about the connections between both authors. And I note that because I did an anti-bibliography, that this article is something I don't agree with, because even though the author is talking about a connection, he doesn't really see it as being important, where I see that connection as being very important. So not only is that an article that does both, but it's also my point of counterpoint, so that I can start my article with a disagreement. I also found a really neat article on the internet that I printed out, and I punched binder holes in it just to keep it organized because it's kind of long. With internet sources, if you're like me and you have bad eyes, right, I tend to print a lot out. It's a bad habit. If you want to be more sustainable, and you should be more sustainable, I'd recommend using your internet bookmarks or a site like Delicious to organize your internet resources, especially if they're found on the wild internet. Right, if you find them through a subscription service, usually the easiest thing to do is to email it to yourself so you don't lose the article, and or print it out if you have to. So because this article deals specifically with Chris Ware, I'm going to make sure to stick it in a pile specific to that author. And because I'm using this sort of as a secondary source, I'm going to make sure to organize it visually in my space, and I'll show you what I'm doing in a second down there. Another resource on Chris Ware, this is from a newspaper, so I'll stick that in the Chris Ware pile. A book rather, that has a whole chapter on Rudolf Toffler, and so I'm going to put that in the Toffler pile. I got really lucky finding this book on Amazon.com, and I was so intrigued by it that I actually bought a copy. Amazon.com previews are a great way to see whether or not a book is worth purchasing, and if you don't have a lot of money, our Rio Salado Library, as well as many of the local libraries in Arizona, will find just about anything on interlibrary loan for you, because this is clearly about Toffler. I'll put that in his pile. And then you have those sources that are a little bit less obvious, right? So for example, both of these people are comic book artists, and so I found this really great article that talks about the history of comic book framing. And this supports my big point in the thesis, right? That how these people organize their visual stories is of a lot of importance to me. And this stands in direct contrast to the article I found on ProQuest. And so in order to support my point, I'm actually going to want to start talking about this history. And so I'm going to make another special pile just for that. This book's another one that's a little bit awkward because it talks about both the authors. but it doesn't really make a connection point. But I'm going to make sure to visually organize so that I can see that this deals with both. So when I go reaching for my sources, I'll know where to go. And I should also mention that, of course, before you start your research project, make sure you read all the books. I'm using a lot of books for this research, so I've read the articles and I've marked up the books, or I've taken notes separately, just so I know where everyone's argument falls. And again, this is a book that talks about the future of comic books as literature, and I really want like a couple points from his conclusion that I want to reiterate and expand upon in my conclusion. And so I'm going to stick this in yet a different pile. And so what does this result in? I'm hoping I can get this on my web camera now that I've done it. What it kind of looks like is a slightly more organized pile here. But what's nifty is that everything is in a particular order. So this article here at the top is that ProQuest article I disagree with, and this is going to be part of my thesis. I'm going to start here, start at the top. That historical article I put right below it because when I move from my thesis, I'm going to want to talk about the history and give some background to the reader. So it goes from thesis to background. My primary sources are across the middle in the order in which I want to discuss them. So I've got my historical pile with stuff about Toffler Fellow. I've got my Chris Ware pile with stuff about the Chris Ware Fellow. And kind of in between them both, I have the bridging source, the book that talks about them both. Right, so visually, all my sources are in the order in which I want to use them. And of course, this conclusion that has a cool point I want to expand upon in my conclusion is at the end of this little source tree. And so when I lay out my sources, I always want to make sure that I do it visually, and that way when I'm sitting writing the paper, I can just grab from the piles, right? Most normal people probably do it on a kitchen table and not on their office floor, but I'm a kinesthetic learner, and I like to be able to move and see things visually.